This is Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, a digital space where we explore the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition and comment on current events. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by my friend, Victor Bruno from Brazil. Victor, why don't you say a couple things about yourself to introduce yourself to our listeners?
All right, then. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad you invited me. I'm a writer, and I have a Substack called Cartas da Tradição, Traditional Letters. And I'm also the author of two books, one called both in Portuguese, and one is called A Imagem Estilhaçada, The Shattered Image. It's on philosophy of the Middle Ages, especially on the victory of nominalism over realism at the
Mm.
at late scholasticism, and the other is a study on a French philosopher called René Guénon, uh, uh, French French esotericist, that although an esotericist, played a crucial part in the development of religious thought. He influenced Mircea Eliade and Maritain. He was friends with him,
Okay.
and I thought he deserved a study, and so I wrote these books. And I'm also an essayist. Uh, I've written primarily in English, so this is something that American the American audience can read. Recently, my latest essay was published in New Oxford Review. It's about Frederick Williamson, about whom we talked
Mm.
about a few months ago.
That's great. That's great. That's awesome. It's a great background. That we need to find a translate. Excuse me, adjust my chair. We need to find a translator for that book, The Shattered Image. That's
Well, I'm glad that you said that because it's so odd because it's a really it's a smallish book. It's a little over 100 pages, and I've had English speaking readers interested
Mm.
in reading it, and the first question they ask is, well, is it in English? Can I find it an English version? No, so far you can't, but
Okay.
with God's God's help, we might find a translator for it.
Okay. That's great. It's a key issue, a really important issue, I think. It's one of those issues. Actually, I was teaching medieval philosophy last semester, and one of the universities in the area, and one of the students said, we started talking about nominalism and realism, and one of the students said, Dr. Smith, once you realize that this issue exists, you realize it touches everything. And I was like, you're right, it does touch everything. That's a good observation. Uh,
Including economy, because modern economy and capitalism, of which we'll talk about in a moment,
mm,
uh, is is an effect of nominalism. Because
I agree.
uh, you know, state controlled usury, which is my definition of capitalism, is um, is a radical application of nominalism. Because if there is no if there are no universals, if there is no
Hmm.
substance, then things can be, contrary to Occam's razor, things can be split apart indefinitely because there are no
Correct.
essences. So everything that exists is individual pieces. So there is
Hmm.
no human being of which Victor is an extent of
Hmm.
expression, and Ben is an extent of expression. So
Hmm.
the same goes to money. Money
Hmm.
is soul, and so everything is irrelevant because everything is just atom, compartmentalized. So
Yes.
and goes to money.
Yeah.
And so another definition of capitalism perhaps is nominalism applied.
Very good. Excellent. Well, that's apropos. Today, we want to talk about Catholic social justice, the Catholic understanding of social justice. This is especially important for a variety of reasons, but certainly because, we just we're joyous and happy to receive a new pope recently. It has an interesting background, and it's sort of seems like he's both from the United States and not from the United States. Like he's sort of from the United States, but he's also spent a lot of time abroad, and sort of where was that? Peru, was it?
It's
Where was it?
Peru.
Peru, yeah, right. So it spent a great time, time being a missionary in Peru, which is great. Um, but he chose Leo, right? And chose Leo. He says in part because he was interested in the social justice side of things, and especially insofar as Rerum Novarum, which kind of began this tradition of thought, at least in the modern period, um, that it how Rerum Novarum dealt with the new things of that time, so sort of industrialization. Um, but we need to also think about dealing with the new things of our own time, including things like artificial intelligence, right? Which I was actually really interested to see that His Holiness address that. You don't think about the Pope thinking about artificial intelligence, right? But as a matter of fact, it was something he said really explicitly, and I was like, huh, that's interesting that he would have that as something that's on the front of his radar.
Yeah, absolutely. I he chose. He didn't say that, but I believe that
Mm,
the origin of his regal name is twofold. He obviously had Leo the 13th in mind, but
mm,
also brother Leo, one of the
mm,
followers of Saint Francis of Assisi.
mm.
So yeah,
That's
that's
great.
very interesting. That's something I found out the other day. And he didn't say that, and I don't think that he explicitly wants to evoke the image of Pope Francis because whether he
Mm.
wanted it or not, he was a controversial pope.
Sure. Yeah.
He, and Pope Leo, as Cardinal Prevost, went on
Hmm.
record to say that not all of his meetings with the late Pope were all that pleasant. Uh,
I don't think he was unique in that respect. I think Pope Francis
yeah,
had a strong temper for what you could kind of read between the lines.
he was an Argentinian, and as a Brazilian, I can say that Argentina is pleasant.
Gotcha.
And okay, but uh, he obviously is in tune, and I believe that it's high time that the church is attuned to to deal with social economic issues
Mm,
the way it it should deal with these
mm,
subjects because um, Rare Navarro's Catholic social doctrine, Catholic social teaching, um, is very well developed, and especially in my view, the first part in the early 20th century,
mm,
now from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, and then the 60s happen, Vatican II happens, and then it stops. And then,
mm,
not that the church stopped caring or paying attention to those issues, but it became social doctrine became a point of contention
mm,
because the issue was hijacked by some elements in the church, and
mm.
then it became awfully politicized, especially
Right.
here in Latin America,
Mm.
because you have liberation theology,
Sure.
and in Peru actually you have the strongest uh, political Catholic movements
Mm,
um, that try to basically make the church into an AOG,
mm,
NGO actually,
mm,
and then the subject became, and then you had these very sensible split between political Catholicism in the
mm,
manner of dealing with social issues, social justice, and then uh, an aesthetic Catholicism, which is more
mm,
conservative, both
mm.
in theology as well as in politics.
Interesting.
And I believe that John Paul II's papacy was the high time of aesthetic Catholicism,
Mm,
believe it or not. And I'll tell you why. Because
okay.
this was the time where the church seemed to be assimilating the United States because you have
Mm,
the anti-communist crusade,
mm.
the Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul
Sure.
II's trio, against the Soviet
Mm,
Union. And then since we were allies with we as Catholics were allies with the United States against the Soviet Union, against
Hmm.
Russia. Well, the word uh, social teaching or social justice, these two
Hmm.
terms become, red flags. They
Yeah.
talk about it.
Hmm.
And I believe that this experiment collapsed. It didn't work. You know, the Soviet Union fell, but the church lost 30 or 40 years uh, in this regard, about these
Hmm.
issues. And meanwhile, progressive, I don't like this word progressive, meaning, um, left wing,
Hmm.
but for lack of a better word, progressive elements hijack the subject and
Right.
they are as strong as ever. And it's
Hmm.
time that the church doctrinally takes this issue back and,
Hmm.
you know do something with it dogmatically, magisterially.
Hmm.
An early step in that direction perhaps was Laudato Si, but
Hmm.
it wasn't enough, and it was before the Francis papacy was hijacked by some of these elements. I don't know
Right.
if the audience would like me to go through the subject, but
Hmm.
we're talking about the Jesuits. You know who
Right.
I'm talking about.
Right. Right.
And again, the church was, fell by the wayside and
Mm.
lost time in that area. So,
Yeah.
general view.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good introduction. I think the subject matter. I think there's a lot to say there. One, I really the trio of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and JP2, right? To the American Catholic of my age and say older. So I'm a Gen X, not quite a boomer, but like to myself, and then say the older. Like that's just like an almost magical image, right? Like the three of them together, is just and for whatever, I mean, you do have the benefit of overcoming communism, of course. Um, but there is a real deficiency in that as well, right? And I can't remember, Victor, if it was, I think maybe it was Benedict the 16th said this, that looking back on things, he recognized that he had underestimated, sort of in the opposition to communism, had underestimated the degree to which kind of capitalistic liberalism was also a problem for the Catholic faith, right? And so he, like yes, it makes sense for JP2 to have this strong sort of push against communism, given his own experience and so forth. But and we were sort of pushing together, right, with I guess you could say kind of neoliberal, sort of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But actually, once the peace has been achieved, like the victory has been achieved, and you're sort of your peace, you sort of look around, you're like, well, actually, this is not that helpful either, right? And that is the kind of unrestrained capitalism, right? That both Thatcher and Reagan, sort of promoted. And then, maybe a little more deeply, I think I'm a real big fan of the encyclical Quadragesimo Humano. And one of the things that comes across really clearly there, and I think this is true in Rerum Novarum as well, is that Pius the 11th really sees the advent of capitalism as the original problem,
Oh
right?
yeah.
That is, he certainly condemns socialism. He certainly criticizes socialism and does so in strong terms. But he starts with the problem is the emergence of industrial capitalism with its concentration of wealth within the hands of the few. I mean, he just literally says that, right? And that causes all these different other problems, social and economic problems within the political sphere. So there is a recognition. There was a recognition, right, that really capitalism's the first mistake, right? Socialism is an errant attempt to redress that problem, right? So I think you can draw some. I mean, I'm like I like to follow Thomas's example. Thomas Aquinas, I can draw insights and truths from anyone, right? Wherever the truth is, it's mine, right? So if every once in a while Marx has a point, I don't mind borrowing a little bit from Marx, and if sometimes other people do, then that's fine. That all that said, the point is, I think we do have to recognize. I think the part of um, that the situation with Catholic social teaching, right, and the way it has been politicized, has prevented us from seeing capitalism as a problem that we need to address.
Absolutely. Benedict, who I believe, said that if you have known how much of a problem capitalism was, had he read less Yves Congar and
Mm,
more Leo the 13th, he would have noticed that.
mm,
And JP2 belatedly recognized how much of a problem capitalism, liberal capitalism, was because he wrote Centésimos Anos.
right. Yeah.
Um, but it was already too late.
Mm,
And, and I believe that the public in America, I, let me just say this. I believe that Catholicism is in a high time in America,
mm,
although it is very convoluted at this time
mm,
because Catholicism in America is mainly young people stuff. It's
mm,
for people of my age, I'm 29 and
mm,
younger. Um, but it is so fractally distributed among,
mm,
you know, innumerable movements, including, but not limited to, TLN and,
mm,
Taylor Marshalls
mm,
and this kind of stuff, that Americans don't pay attention to the enormity of the problem that capitalism is from a Catholic standpoint. Because as you said, uh, America is a fruit of the Industrial Revolution and of
mm,
unchecked money power.
mm,
And um, what's the problem? Is that when Americans read rare novella, for instance,
mm,
um, all they see is that uh, are the paragraphs where Leo says that private property is a natural right. But
mm,
why he's saying that private property is a natural right? He doesn't have Karl Marx in mind. He
mm,
has that in traditional economy, uh, it is a given that what you own is yours and not
mm,
collective, and that good that you have, or be that a donkey or a chart
mm,
or land, is fungible because it has
mm,
no intrinsic value, previous a prioristic intrinsic value. It is a good that which value is relative to your needs and desires. So that's why you can have economy without money. The
mm,
problem of capitalism is that it kills for good as no other economic system had killed before, not even in ancient Rome, late ancient Rome, where usury was rampant. Uh, the no other economic system had mobilized the free agency of men as capitalism uh, does. If most people want to set up a new, I don't know the intricacies of uh, setting up a venture in the United States, but I believe it's
mm,
simpler than here in Brazil. uh, you need money to have money.
mm,
Most people have heard that phrase before. You need money to make money, and that's not natural. What's natural is
mm,
that you have something you can exchange in exchange for something you need.
mm,
And it says nowhere in the book, it says nowhere in the book of nature is said that something you need to exchange is money. It can be anything.
mm,
And when, what is it that capitalism does that is so heinous for the natural order? Is that it constrains you it hinders your assets, things that you
mm,
have. invaluable because you need liquidity. You have to make it liquid so you can use it in the economic system. And since things have no intrinsic value, economical intrinsic value, you are at the mercy either of the banks or
Mm.
to whoever you were trying to liquidate it to, or to the usurer. And,
Mm-hmm.
and to top things off, the church in beginning in the 50s and 60s chose to remain silent about how sinful that behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have stocks, if you own stocks, are you incurring the sin of usury or not? Because you
Mm-hmm.
are part of this economic system. You are the heart of this sinful
Mm-hmm.
economic system, and you have no one to consult with.
Sure.
And so, am I sinning? Am I not sinning? Is this a sin?
Mm-hmm.
And the church is saying nothing on the subject.
Right.
And this is a very dangerous position for the church to be in. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is for me, this is the crux of the problem regarding capitalism.
Mm.
It is inherently, it demands you to incur in the sin of usury, and right now there is no one to guide you through it.
That's interesting. And you would say that's the case because of the priority of capital in terms of economic creativity and economic production and things like that. You have to have capital first,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why usury is going to be necessarily involved in sort of a capitalist system.
So um, let's say um, let me try to give you uh, uh, a practical example. Uh, let's say you and I, we want to set up a podcast studio
Okay,
in a physical podcast studio, with state of the art equipment, a good camera, good
sure.
microphone, good backdrop,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a nice background TV screen,
Mm-hmm.
so on. And then we need to raise like $20,000.
Mm.
I don't have $20,000. There's
Right.
probably, so we have to take a loan.
Right, right.
Immediately we are incurring
Mm,
debt.
right.
Oh,
That's okay.
this is my youngest. Just a second.
That's okay.
Okay. Uh,
It's good. You have your priorities in order. That's good.
he, he runs the house. Uh, okay, so we have to take up a loan. So we have to begin by incurring into debt.
Hmm.
The question is that the system is set up in such a manner that you have money gurus who say that that's the way to go, and if you can pay it back you can just declare bankruptcy. That's Robert Kiyosaki for you.
Hmm.
So it is not fair, and if
Hmm.
it's not fair to people who are trying to just set up a podcast studio, how about people who are low, really low
Hmm.
in the economic pyramid?
Sure.
And well, you can argue that things were always this way, in the Middle Ages. But then you had, guilds and
Sure.
and unions, the early vertical unions, not the horizontal unions.
Hmm.
And well, the point is that we have no cushion in
Hmm.
this kind of economy,
Right.
and the cushion that was provided by the church, in labor economies, and we don't have that anymore.
Hmm.
So the system is completely askew,
Hmm.
and uh, and the church is nowhere to be found except in those clergy that try to make that a springboard for class warfare.
Right.
That's
Hmm.
where liberation theology comes in.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's the problem.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. It's a great way of putting it. Just listening to you talk there, thinking a little bit about um, when I think about capitalism, I always try to have a decent definition or at least description of it as an economic system, right? So one way of describing it, right? There's probably several different ways you could approach this, but one way of describing it is that it's an economy in which capital determines the distribution of goods and services, right? And so, but what's interesting about that, right, is there's a kind of, and this kind of goes, I think, a little bit to what you're talking about in terms of human agency. There's a certain kind of abstract inhumanity about that, right? Like capital is just it's just like excess resources that doesn't go into your necessities that you can use to for investment, right? Um, and so it's a kind of a thing, right? It could be money, it could be a field, it could be whatever, oil, whatever, something that you have in excess of your needs that you can use as the source, right, of wealth. But really, I mean, I think from a Catholic point of view, you want to say that humans are the source of wealth, right? That is, that human beings, through their ingenuity, their labor, their work, right, their thought process, they're the ones who bring value and create, to things, right? They're the ones who turn trees into books and wonderful things like that, right? Whereas, even the term capitalism, right, kind of makes it sound as if this thing is the source, right? When in fact, no, it's actually really human beings, right? The source of economic achievement, productivity, innovation, all those kinds of things within an economy. Um, so, in terms of when you think about capitalism, in terms of Catholic social teaching, then um, what would you say is like? Is there a specific concrete way we can think about sort of maybe the evil effects of capitalism vis-a-vis Catholic faith, Catholic spirituality, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that the major problem is that we lose of sight of uh, what the church really is.
Mm,
Uh, of course, Catholicism is a religion, of course, but Catholicism is much more than a religion because some people say that the Roman Empire never fell; it
mm,
became the church.
mm,
That's one way to see it, and it's not incorrect altogether.
mm.
The church is the matrix of civilization.
I like that. Yeah.
The church is the church where you go Sunday to see the most holy sacrament, but it also determines the way you behave, what you believe,
Hmm.
your morals, your ethics.
Right.
And capitalism is in stark contrast to the church because we teach charity, we
Right.
teach brotherhood, fraternity, real
Mm,
fraternity, not French Revolution fraternity.
sure.
Uh, and capitalism uh, relegates, the church to these dry set of morals that
Mm.
are sometimes inconvenient.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, Studying for my René Guénon book, of which I spoke earlier, I found one of Guénon's most important vulgarizers, popularizers, was a guy called Luc Benoit, a French writer.
Okay.
And he has this little book that PUF, Presse Universitaire Française, published in the collection Que sais-je, What Do I Know, called Esotericism. It's available in English. And he says, halfway through the book, when he's talking about uh, uh, Christian esotericism, Christian mysticism, he says, um, uh, Catholicism was originally an initiatic religion
Mm,
that had to give in to the pressures of daily life. So it's not initiatic and it's not mystical anymore. It's a
mm,
bunch of course, but the point is that this is the vision of someone who is disillusioned with the faith because
mm,
it became a bourgeois religion, and
right.
that's something perhaps everybody can relate to because the effect that's the real effect of capitalism and of the
Mm,
triumph of capitalism.
interesting.
is that it renders religion, not only Catholicism, but especially Catholicism, into a bourgeois religion. Because it's a set of morals that sometimes are inconvenient. You don't really need to follow that. It's really hard to follow that if you have to uh, operate in the world of capitalism.
Mm,
And if you are fairly well-to-do, you go to mass on Sunday and you perhaps give alms to the poor, and that's about it. And then you sin again, and then you go to the church,
mm,
and the cycle repeats. Um, so that's the problem of capitalism, of modern economy, or perhaps even of the modern world
mm,
in relation to the church. It ossifies it. It
mm,
makes it
mm.
bourgeois. And because we are not living in a Catholic society. And
Right.
why are we living in a Catholic society? Because we are at the mercy of capitalism
Mm,
and other
mm.
things, but especially capital. Capitalism is part of this constellation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that that's well said. Yeah. I mean, it does sort of, I can, there's a way in which capitalism um, does to the church, right? What it also does to humans in the economy, which is to atomize them, right? To set them up against one another, and then to sort of commodify everything about them, right? In a way in which you hide the actual relations. One of the things I think this was maybe in Centesimus on is um, was it how'd you say it? Centesimus, the one by John Paul II?
Centésimos anos.
Yeah, right. That the 100 years, right? So he um, he does talk about the idea, right, that labor is a relation, right? And I think that's so good, right? I mean, like we act as if labor is a commodity, right, within capitalism, right? Instead of seeing as a human person, right, with a relation to an employer, right? And that employer has a relation to him, right? And that it should be a mutually beneficial relation, right? But instead of capitalism, right, we treat labor like a commodity that has a value that's based on the market, right? And we're supposed to get it as cheaply as possible, rather than thinking about the laborer as a human being, right, who has goals and purposes that he should be put in circumstances to strive for with good work and decency and all that kind of qualifications, of course. Um, but I think that's an important thing. So when you see that kind of, I guess, I don't know, dehumanization, right, that works out in capitalism, I think that does kind of make you think about sort of the Catholic faith, right, in a different way, right? You sort of it has a way of, I guess, despiritualizing it, right,
Right.
to some degree, right? And it's kind of like this. There's this one part over here, and I do my religious transactions, and then I go over here and I do my economic transactions, and they're just it's very transactional kind of
Yeah,
approach
it's
to the
fungible.
world. Yeah.
Everything is fungible. And you begin to the average person that dreams of being a self-made man. You
Mm-hmm.
begin talking about the dignity of the worker. He
Mm-hmm.
immediately will go, "Well, aren't you a communist?" Because the dignity of the worker immediately makes me think about union and
Mm-hmm.
strikes.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you know Sergei Eisenstein's film called "The Strike," the revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and and there's no guarantee, especially in this day and age, that if you that the American dream is real, that if
Mm-hmm.
start a company, you will achieve prosperity. And the point is that uh, people are afraid of people these days,
Mm-hmm.
and when you talk about the dignity of labor dignity or the dignity of the worker, and how we can help the work, the the vanishing working class. It's kind of demodel these days talking about the blue collar class or the working
Sure.
class, and even middle class. I think there's an increasing trend. increasing trend of saying that the middle class is over. There's no middle
Mm.
class anymore. We are
Okay.
dangerously, and we are dangerously close to the situation, the middle wages. You know that
Mm.
you have you had the nobility and you had
Mm.
the working class, the workers,
Mm.
and you have no gap.
Right.
The vanishing middle, you know,
Uh,
because what is the middle class? The middle class is that class that is it has no it doesn't have enough money to be aristocrat, but it's not poor either.
mm.
So it's like Peter Drucker wrote, the famous the guy who invented the discipline of management, that
Mm.
the informational workers,
Mm.
people, knowledge workers, no, people who don't work with their hands but with their minds, and this was meant to be the new middle class. But if you work like training AI or large
Mm.
language models, you probably will be paid the same thing that a bricklayer is paid.
Mm. Mm.
No, a junior bricklayer and a junior large language
Mm.
modelist trainer will be paid the same thing or perhaps a little more. What I'm trying to say is that we are in a situation that everybody's kind of paid more or less the same. There's
Mm.
no middle class, and
Mm.
there's no Christianity to underlay the actions and morals of the noble class, the new noble class. Because if in the old days, you had a king or someone running a field that you would have to pay him a percentage of the harvest of the year, but he would provide you land, he would provide you
Mm.
medical help, you'd have a priest,
Mm.
you'd have a bunch of um, of holidays during the year
Mm.
to uh, so you could exercise leisure.
Sure. It also was supposed to provide some sense of law,
So exactly,
you know.
in local law, that is
Mm.
law adjusted to the customs and uses and
Mm.
laws of the locality, of the land,
Mm.
of the
Mm.
paese, or as the Italians say.
Mm.
Do you think Jeff Bezos will do the same for you?
No, it's I mean that I kind of actually cringe a little bit when people call our contemporary situation neo-feudalism. I understand why they do, but I kind of I think they were like feudalism maybe was better, you know. I mean, without being romantic, I can still say I think there was more organic it was more organic and more sort of structured, right, in terms of mutual responsibilities, at least in terms of expectations,
Yeah,
than our contemporary situation, which is, it's just, I'm sorry, we're off by 0.5% of our plan. We're just going to lay off 1,000
yeah.
workers and, whatever,
Exactly. So is it a wonder that that Luigi, I don't know what his name is, shot
mm,
that guy in New
mm,
York? It's not a
yeah,
wonder.
mm,
It's not a wonder because
mm,
the system is humane, and so humane actions will be taken.
mm,
Because that company, I'm starting to sound like a revolutionary, but
mm,
that company denies people who
mm,
need money, and money they
sure.
pay the company
That's
in
right.
exchange for protection, and they
That's right.
never get the protection.
Yeah, so I mean, I've experienced this not in a drastic way, but like in a concrete way in America, where say when one of my father had suffered an injury, it was nothing major, but he's an older man, and he fell and injured himself, and it was the insurance company, not the doctor, who could decide how long he could stay in the hospital. Right, the doctor was like, "I think he needs to stay in the hospital another day," and the insurance company was like, "No, you know." According to our chart, he could go home today. So, right.
Yeah, I read that this guy had his daughter had cerebral palsy, and
Mm,
he's an older guy, and he needed an automatic chair. It was something that would I believe it was an automatic chair. So
mhm,
and he asked the insurance company, can you provide an automatic chair? And the company said, no, she already has a chair and you just push it around. And
Uh,
oh, sorry, I'm not strong anymore. But if you say I can't, probably I can because you are the company, you study it, you
mhm.
know, you have charts, you have
That's
it,
right.
uh, 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 so this is the point. We've come to this. And
Mhm.
in the words of that very intellectual source I will quote right now, the first Mission Impossible film, dying is very expensive in America. And why is it expensive? Because it is, as you said, everything
Mhm.
is commodified.
Mhm.
Everything is quantified. This is the
Mhm.
this is the kingdom of quantity.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
Nothing has value, and
Mhm.
because capital is the only value.
Mhm.
One thing is saying nothing has intrinsic value in relation to the market. As long as I can trade things, things are fungible.
Mhm.
In the modern situation, another thing is the modern situation where everything is worthless, including you, including me,
Mhm.
but capital.
Mhm.
And and I don't really see how the situation, how no one else but the church can solve the situation, or at least meet.
Mhm.
Now the point is, I don't I want to call attention to something that I think is fairly important because um, I do think that religion is the answer to social problems as long as it is dogmatic. And something that pains me a lot is that the church refuses to be dogmatic,
Mhm.
whereas you have Islam. I
Mhm.
imagine that most people frown on the mention of the name Islam, but you have to be reminded that Islam, the Islamic economic system, Islamic banking has no usury.
Right.
Uh, and it's not a wonder why this religion attracts so many people. It's not when people talk about radicalism. Oh my God, so many people are converting to Islam, and so many
Mhm.
young people. I don't think it's a thing anymore. It used to be a thing a few years back, like in
Mhm.
2016, 2017, mass conversions to Islam, and no one bothered to ask why. Oh, it's the internet. The internet is radicalizing. It's not the internet doesn't do anything. People do.
Mhm. Right.
Perhaps one of the answers is that this religion is offering practical solutions. It offers because Islam, just like Catholicism, is a civilizational matrix.
It is. Yeah.
Have a banking system that will not extort you to death if you need to
Mhm.
take a loan.
Mhm.
And it's possible, and it's practical, and it exists, and it's prosperous because most Islamic countries are prosperous. A good deal of Islamic countries are prosperous. So that's something to think about, I believe.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's great as a practical point. Just a couple of things I want to bring up. One was an example. We talk about the shrinking of the middle class. You know, Aristotle says that all things considered, although a virtuous man will do best will make a good situation out of, will make good out of a bad situation if he's poor. And he says a virtuous aristocrat can do great things. All things considered, it's easiest to be virtuous in the middle because you don't have so little that you despair and fall into decadence, nor do you have so much that you overindulge and fall into decadence. Right? You're kind of in the middle. You have enough that you're sort of you feel a certain amount of security, but you also can't overindulge because you might fall then, right? So there's something interesting about that. But more seriously, one of the things, it was an interesting BBC documentary I saw about this, and the uh, the person who was the narrator was talking about the fact that his father during the 50s and 60s served his whole career as a full-time bus driver in the UK and was able to buy a house, support his wife to stay at home, and raise two kids, as a full-time bus driver,
Yeah.
right? He said, you try to do that in the modern UK, it's like it's just not even remotely possible, right? And there is something that has shifted, and one of those areas I think is sort of in the area of greed, in terms of not forcing companies to take care of their employees properly. The what sometimes I call the financialization of profit, where profit is just put into these financial instruments that hardly anyone understands and are kind of shady. And instead of saying, "Oh, we're a profitable company, so let's raise the wages of our employees," right? Well, we're a profitable company, so let's financialize this and give us all of us, more stock options, or
Yeah,
we buy
yeah.
back the
That's what
stock or
I'm
something
going
like
to
that,
say. You did that. Oh, we had an excellent year. Why raise wages? Why don't we pay more dividends to the stockholders?
Yeah, all right, right,
Screw the
yeah,
worker.
that's right. And this is exactly what I would want to tell those maybe who are listening who are thinking about it, from more of a corporate point of view, or maybe have the experience of being a leader, right? Say in business, an ethical business owner, right? A Catholic business owner, should see that situation and see that as an opportunity, right, to better his employees, right, for the common good of his society, right, and out of love for humanity, right. Now, I don't think we should just leave that to the largesse, right, of the business owner. It should be a matter of law, but regardless, let's just say it's not a matter of law. There is a way in which you can try to operate properly, rightly, and run a company, right? And that would be a way to do that, right? Um, Albeit it's difficult because you do have the issue of competition, right? And that's the other thing I wanted to bring up about capitalism is because capital is if you define your economy in terms of capital at any singular point is finite, right? And your power within that economic system is going to be defined by your access and possession of capital. So it becomes inherently competitive, right? Which divides people against each other in competition for this individual good of possession of capital. And that just as from a political philosophy point of view, right, seems to me exactly wrong, right? Right. What we want is not division and competition. What we want is cooperation and unity, as so much as there can be. Obviously, with plenty of room for a certain amount of diversity and individuality and so forth, but still all coming together, right, and collaborating such that we are working together to better each other and ourselves. Um, I think that is under the common good, right? So that that's one of the real problems. Then I think of capitalism, right? Is it sets you up in this situation where I have to look out for my individual good because I know nobody else is, right? And to heck with the common good, whatever that is, right? And so I think that can bleed over across though your life, which is problematic, right? Is this prioritization of the individual good over the common good? And when I talk about the common good, with people sometimes, one of the things I like to point out, usually I'm often talking about the political common good. Um, but there are many common goods in our lives, right? There's goods that we share with others, right? You think about you were just talking about your child that was there, right? Your children, the children are the common good of the parents, right? And the procreation and education of those children, right? You think about how much joy that brings into the family. I remember when our first children were born, and they were the first grandchildren, right, in the family. And so, you think about how important that is to the whole family, right? Everybody's excited. They're all part of it. It's those goods we share with other people, right? That are the best goods of our lives, right? And you think about everything from a good conversation to, your children, etc. And then you can move your way up to higher common goods. Um, but that sort of negligence of the common good and antipathy really to the common good, I think, is inherent in capitalism and one of its chief problems.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm looking for something that I recently wrote that I believe will be interest to the reader because what we are discussing is especially poignant, is of special import to Americans because uh, the American system. It's important to emphasize that American America is the firstborn child of modernity. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
French Revolution. It's
Mm-hmm.
the United States
Mm-hmm.
because it was born out of a middle class revolt,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, there is it, I know Americans like to proud themselves for, you know, you begin counting the birth of your country, which is will be in a few days' time, like
Mm-hmm.
4th of July. Uh, Americans like to count the birth of their country uh, by their independence, whereas we in
Mm-hmm.
Brazil count the birth of our country from the day that Pedro Álvares Cabral, the navigator who first happened upon these lands, set
Mm-hmm.
in 1500s. So we are,
Interesting.
yeah, it's different. I never understood
Yeah.
why because the image of the pilgrims, crossing the Atlantic and happening upon Plymouth Rock is so
Mm-hmm.
vivid in the minds of America.
Mm-hmm.
But you begin counting the country by the independence. And okay, I just found it because what I'm trying to say is that uh, America is the firstborn child of modernity, and it is inherently modern in such a manner that you guys have no other history but the history of modernity. So it's like there are no historical or natural uh, crutches to help on your walk, in your walk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really kind of, everybody against each other and God against all kind of situation.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
interesting. Yeah.
and and you see, this is, as you said, this is a subject, this is an issue, it's an
Mm-hmm.
important issue that it's not contained in the economic sphere. It spills over to the moral, to daily life.
Sure.
No. And this is what I want to read, something I wrote in my essay, Who Murdered Christendom, which was published in New Oxford Review, the latest issue of New Oxford Review. Uh, this is what Frederick Williamson says.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in Williamson's view, the great problem of American politics is that, contrary to traditional Catholic belief, we hold we hold sin as freedom. Sin in what sense? Our cherished American freedoms are based on the assumption that individuals will naturally settle disputes in the most rational and optimal way. This view is not the traditional view of law, justice, and politics, but the 18th century rationalistic view. As such, the US Constitution is an instrument that, instead of creating a tribunal to represent natural or God's law, instills, quote, tension in the diverse interests of people, close quotes, Williamson's writes. This is to say that the Constitution created a country full of enemies. It also helped to create a mass society. If a desired outcome of a dispute, be it an election, the passing of a law, or a judicial matter, is based on the number of people who vote for that outcome, then it stands to reason that learning how to manipulate people to go my way is the way
Mm-hmm.
to go in the society. A
Mm-hmm.
man is a great man because he can manipulate or outfox other men. So
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty much capitalism. If you read
Mm-hmm.
the biography of John D. Rockefeller or
Yeah, sure.
just about any capitalist, that's their story. They were foxy guys. They were really,
I like that fox. Yeah, they're fox. Yeah. Yeah, they're foxes and lions though, which is interesting too. Um, our lions in American, at least mythology, right, are cowboys,
yeah, exactly.
right? Or they're cowboys and they're war heroes, right? Those are our lions, right? But yeah, the fox, the capitalist is kind of a good image. That's a really interesting. I really like Wilhelmsen quite a bit. I I would maybe introduce a little bit of a twist on that, just a little bit, which is that formally speaking, in terms of the intellectual structure, right? that he's addressing, I think he's correct, right? Um, but of course, an actual society isn't just its intellectual structure, right? There are other things on the ground, right, that may not, the intellectual may not take into full account of, right? So you think about the other side of this would be Alexis de Tocqueville's view, right? Which is America, which is interesting, right? Because he says America can only really work as long as the local bonds are organic and real, right? Now, what I think is that there was a time where you said the Pledge of Allegiance, you prayed in school, even public schools. There was a sort of an expectation that everybody was at least Protestant, right? Maybe Catholic. Okay, we'll accept them eventually, right? And then eventually we got accepted, right?
Yeah, but
Um,
the problem is if you were a Catholic in to the early 20th century, you weren't white. So
sure,
that's
right,
another
right,
problem.
yeah. The so the but there was more cultural hegemony there that they had to help them. I think, put it this way, liberalism like this only works insofar as there are non-liberal elements to support it.
Yeah,
Right. And so I think there were non-liberal elements that kind of helped the United States for a long time, despite its liberal polity or its liberal political philosophy. Over time, those non-liberal elements have diminished and withered away, right? And so we really are. So those kinds of non-liberal elements that would have, um, like for example, did we have an aristocracy? I would say not in name, but we certainly had one informally, right?
right.
For quite a long time. I mean, you called it a middle class revolt, and I think that that's true-ish. But really, when you think about people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they're pretty aristocratic, actually, when you really look at their lives, right? I mean, these are guys who live on vast estates, a lot of them, anyways,
And then
especially the Virginia
Jefferson
version.
deliberately imitate, French aristocracy,
Sure, right.
French,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
French.
So, anyways, but I just kind of for myself when I think about America, and of course, I'm from the southern United States, which has its own little, you know, unusual or slightly distinct cultural vibe to it. I think traditional Catholics and traditional Americans. Does that phrase make sense? Traditional Americans. Do we have a tradition? Um,
I think so.
I think maybe, but you have to reach pretty far back, right? I can remember growing up, so I came from a very conservative family. So I can remember growing up and people still talking occasionally like, well, we need to maintain our Anglo-Saxon heritage, right? And what that meant is we need to stay British, right? Like at our core, there's some sort of connection to England, right? There's some sort of connection to Western civilization, right? Through the English version of that, you might say.
Can I
Um,
give you a Brazilian perspective on this?
sure.
Because it's so interesting because uh, we declared our independence from Portugal,
Mm,
and up until the 50s, it was very common to there was a real Brazilian Portugal connection,
mm,
and we actually celebrated with great pomp the 200 year anniversary of actually the 100th year uh, anniversary of independence. And
mm,
in 1922, actually the image was two women kissing. One
mm.
was one dressed as the Brazilian flag, and the other
I say, gotcha.
weird, very weird. And then it vanished, and then this link, this relation
Mm,
vanished,
mm,
and it was crucial to the growth of Brazilian identity to depart from Portugal.
mm,
Whereas I feel that Americans still have a good deal of interchange with uh, England.
mm,
Of course, as with England subordinated to the
mm,
United States in the present.
mm. Yeah.
And I don't think this relation will never disappear. Never.
Mm,
what might happen is that I think it will come to an age that where Americans, especially in the South, perhaps,
mm,
and in the West, will try to break away again from the
mm,
Union
mm.
because the country seems to be so fractalized,
It really
and
is.
there are elements. You're from the South, but
Mm.
you don't, at least from this perspective, from my perspective, you don't immediately think of the South as Catholic, but it seems to be where the bulk of Catholicism in America is in the South, no
Yeah,
least in
there's a lot
Florida,
of growth of Catholicism in the South, that's for sure.
and
Mhm.
from the Spanish community.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting. There's both. There's both. Certainly through the Spanish community, for sure. But there's also a lot of transplants from the north too, right? Because at this point, the South is a little more prosperous than a lot of the northeastern states. Not the West, but the northeastern states, anyways. Um, but there is some growth there. But it is interesting. The not to go too far down this, but there is sort of a old kind of. I mean, the South is very. I like the state I live in is probably the most evangelical state in the whole union. Right? It's like the reddest of the red states. Right? And it's just like it's interesting because it's very in some ways everything you could say critical about America is true. That like we just like I know a lot of history. I teach a lot of history to my children, right? And they come back from school and they're like, Dad, like nobody knows anything about history. And it's cool. I'm like, yeah, it's true. Like Americans do have that side of us, right? We're kind of like history. What's that, right? Like that's before America, right? So like, which is of course awfully arrogant and terrible, but nevertheless. But just to kind of go back to the main point, I think of your criticism of what Wilhelmsen said, I think is correct, right? That liberalism is sort of built in there, right? Without enough. But here's the funny thing: is this is the part where I think a left kind of criticism, kind of like say Herbert Marcuse, his criticisms of freedom of speech, right, in the liberal setting, right, is that Anglo-Saxons working out this idea of the liberal state, right? There's most of them are British philosophers, not all of them, right, but a lot of them are, and I don't think that they recognized how much culturally they were actually assuming, even though because the way they describe it, it's almost if you don't share a culture, right? And you don't share an ethos, and you don't share a version of the common good, right, with your the people in society. Well, as a matter of fact, you probably do, right? Like most human beings who live together have some view, right? Some shared views about the good. There might not be a lot, but there'll be some, right? um, the so in any event, but the way that they describe it philosophically, right, is this sort of Hobbesian, disunity, right? They think though, let's see, what I think is they were able to think that way, and they thought they were using rational agreement to sort everything out, but really they were just relying on good old English Christian customs, right?
Yeah,
As a matter of fact, right? It did
absolutely.
manage that we could work out a rational agreement because we all happen, or most of the people happen to be Christians or approximate to, like, maybe one generation away from being Christian or something like that. Um, but in any event, yeah.
That seems to be the case. Of course, they assume the community uh,
Hmm.
of similar thinking people,
Hmm.
and in which case it's correct. And I'm told that here's something interesting about the setting up of the 13 colonies when the
Hmm.
states, sovereign states at that, and later
Hmm.
they converged to a single nation, is that John Adams used explicitly the fueros, the Spanish fueros system.
Hmm.
Uh,
I didn't know that.
he thought that each state was his own fuero, which means which people who are unfamiliar with Spanish traditional political system is that the fueros were the king lorded over the fueros, but very limited.
Hmm.
His main duty was to warrant the freedom of the fueros where they attacked or no, where they assault in some sort, and he wasn't even the ultimate instance for judgment. Uh,
Mm.
it was more or less a figure of unity to which the Fueros entrusted their protection, and he had the right to lord over there, provided that we respected the regional and local customs
Yeah.
and laws.
Can I ask you
So
about that? Is that connected at all to the Carlist movement in Spain?
yeah, that's connected with the
Okay,
Carlist.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You read about that in Miguel Ayuso and Rafael
Mm.
Cabral, the two great Carlist thinkers. But and there is a letter where John Adams actually talks about that that's how he viewed the role of each state.
Hmm.
And it so happened that in Spain that vanished in the 19th century with the Carlist Wars, and the Carlists lost, and the
Hmm.
Carlists were kicked out from the country.
Hmm.
And then centralized government took hold, and it led to the First Spanish Republic, then
Hmm.
to fascism,
Hmm.
to Francoism, actually.
Hmm.
And I believe that the Carlist movement in America was FDR,
Hmm.
because if you think that Trump is
Hmm.
Mad King, well, you gotta see FDR dressed as Caesar in
Hmm.
his first anniversary as president in 1933.
That's great.
So that's the growth of central government, and that's
Sure.
the moment where America pivoted as from being a this new feuerist
Mm.
country to a more centralized kind of government. And by the time
Mm.
Kennedy was murdered, the
Mm.
transition was complete.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So what do you think, Victor, about in terms of like prospects with respect to Catholic social teaching, social justice, and capitalism going forward, in terms of like what the church is doing, and then maybe also a little bit more concretely, like what's going, like what the church can do, maybe even at the local level.
Yeah. Um, there are two paths here. In at the major level to drive this to the finish line, uh, we have to see what Leo will say in his first,
Mm.
at least in the first encyclical,
Mm.
uh, that he talks about the subject, which I believe will be his very first.
Okay.
Uh, I think that it's summer now in the Northern Hemisphere, so we probably won't see that before the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Together with his first consistory, I'm very uh, I'm very anxious to see who he will give to whom he will give the red hat.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that um, perhaps I'm fairly suspicious of synodality. I don't
Okay.
know if that's a good idea, but
Mm-hmm.
it might provide a way out, because if the local churches, as in the synodal parliaments,
Mm-hmm.
have all that power, it happens. It's on us to uh, bring this forward
Mm-hmm.
and strive to work as lady together with parishes and the dioceses to try to uh, give this a new attention, a renewed attention. And it falls upon us to recover the traditional Catholic social teaching.
Great. Mm.
Uh, we are in a very dangerous moment in church history, with all the transformations since the 60s. Um, but the church, to use a managerial parlance, has a huge institutional memory. So all the
Mm-hmm.
encyclicals are available. You know. Social teaching, traditional good social teaching, is available for us to learn and then disseminate. So if the church wants to go down the synodal path, which mirrors a bit the church in the Middle Ages, uh,
Mm-hmm.
then it's on us. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and we gotta uh, get the ball rolling.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So the first step is that, and then we got to pray a lot for the Pope to to speak, teach the way he should. Um, and just to give a final word on the subject, uh, we shouldn't lose any more time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finishing an article. It's about liturgy, and one of my concluding remarks is that uh, it will perhaps we are perhaps 2 or 3 papacies away, so we're likely not to see it. Uh, from the moment where Vatican II is just one another concept,
Mm-hmm.
and so young people who would like to get the church back to normalcy
Mm-hmm.
should start to act now. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in whatever issue is this that they are happen to be interested in: social teaching, liturgy, in theology, and so forth. So, because the church moves slowly,
Mm-hmm.
and we should look for the long haul, but we should start acting now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's great. You know what they at some so I hate bringing using this phrase, but it's actually correct. I think I think it's a I'm not sure exactly what left wing thinker said this, but he said that at some point the 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 revolutionary movement has to actually look like the goal at which you're striving for, right? Right. So I know that sounds kind of weird to bring into this context, but I kind of like the idea, right? That you use this phrase for correct me, civilizational matrix.
yeah,
Okay.
civilizational matrix.
Well, I could kind of guess what you mean by that. Maybe you could say more about that in a minute. But I like this idea that the Catholic Church, of course, is a religion, right? But it's also a civil, like it's a society. It's a global set of communities, right? All sort of bound together, right? In the liturgy, under the hierarchy, through the sacraments, through our tradition. As somebody who came into the Catholic Church as a convert in my early 20s, this was something that was very important to me, right?
Yeah,
Is the feeling of connection to the past and to the wider world, right? Like I was like, oh, the past now I'm part of that. It's part of me, and I have this connection with everyone else. Um, it would be great if Catholic communities looked really different, right? And Catholic businesses just were known to be really different, right? Than other businesses, right? And you were just like, wow, I'd love to work for a Catholic employer, just because I know they treat their people so well, that kind of thing. That's what I mean by sort of the movement looking like the ultimate goal
yeah,
is that you not to get too far into this because again I'm not a realized eschatology guy, but I still kind of sympathize a little and say, it should look a little different, right? It should look a little like the kingdom, right? Um,
yeah, absolutely.
to come, even if it's not, of course, ever going to be fully realized in history and time. Um, but that's great. I like that way of approaching it. Um, in terms of what do you think about Catholic? And of course, this will be different, I'm sure, in Brazil than the United States, but at least to some degree. What do you think about Catholic political action?
It should be grounded in tradition.
Hmm.
The answer is that we have
Hmm.
all these answers. They really exist. It should be grounded in tradition.
Hmm.
Now, this should be a separate talk because then we would
Hmm.
have to talk about the dual allegiance that every Catholic has to make, which was a big bone of contention in the early
Hmm.
20th century, to the state authority and the Pope, which is a
Hmm.
second state. But the main answer is it should be grounded in tradition, and we should go back to the sources.
Mm,
Resource.
hmm.
That's the first thing.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, that's good. You always want to stay connected to that for sure. The because it does provide us with guidance in a particular, because you don't want to, of course, you don't want your Catholicism to get subsumed by your politics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You want your Catholicism to drive and direct, right? Your Catholic action. Um, just I'll leave you, kind of, we've gone here. I think just about long enough, but I'd leave you with one thought here. Would you think about this in terms of the way I think about, sort of trying to talk about this? I mean, one is of course talking about it, right? That is, let's study the Catholic social teaching. It's a real thing. Let's learn about it. Um, obviously, I write a good bit about this kind of stuff, so that's one of the things. But then the other is, in whatever small ways we can, to just say no, right? To um, the capitalist lifestyle, maybe just in small ways, but still trying to do that, right? That is, you know, um, one way of talking about this is valuing contemplation. One thing that capitalists and socialists agree on is that contemplation is useless. Isn't that interesting? Both
Yeah,
capitalists and socialists hate contemplative orders more than anything else, right? They really despise, right, the idea, well, you're going to just sit there and pray, right? Like what is that? That sort of thing. So I think, things like that, where like spend time in contemplation, spend time doing things for their own sake, spend time with friends who you love because they're your friends, that sort of thing. Or small ways in which you can say no to that lifestyle, right?
yeah,
And try to show that you have sort of a different way of living, a different way of valuing people and things, right? All those sorts of things. Well, Victor, I appreciate. Do you have any thought about that before we sign off?
yeah. Just a final word. It's no wonder if you are attuned to what young people are saying. There's a Mediterranean moment on the internet right now. You see
Mm,
edits from a London Long Films and from the talented Mr. Ripley,
mm,
people on yachts on in the Mediterranean,
Okay, yeah, I got you.
on
I got you.
bathing. All this comes from young people in America, and it's really interesting that in this moment of crisis, people are looking to this very Catholic region of the world, the
Hmm.
Mediterranean,
Sure.
uh, uh, musing about doing nothing, which is the final goal, as you know better than I do. It's the final goal of ancient philosophy. It's the otium,
Hmm.
leisure, as Joseph Piper said.
Hmm.
Because the life of the entrepreneur, the capitalist entrepreneur, is that of an animal. It's
Hmm.
you guys don't have this word in English, but um, business, which comes from business, it's
Mm,
thing.
yeah.
In Portuguese, we call it negócio, which comes from
Mm.
Latin, nec otium, not leisure,
Oh wow, that's neat. That's neat. That's a neat etymology. I like that.
and which is the life of an animal who is always hunting and trying to procreate and
Hmm.
and so a little more leisure is
Hmm.
Catholic way to go. I believe.
That's good. Yeah, that's great.
That,
Yeah,
that's
we
what I
could maybe sometime talk about Joseph Pieper's book as a political book. I think, which would be kind of funny. But he's so good on that. It's one of the books I sometimes recommend to people when they're first getting into Thomas.
yeah.
Is that book? Because it is really challenging. Like I even asked my own boys one time. I said, "Is leisure or work better?" And they thought about it, they were like, well, work. I was like, no,
Where's work?
not.
We should be entrepreneurs.
That's right. But again, yeah, that's something that socialists and capitalists would agree on, is that
Yeah,
work is better.
absolutely.
But Marx sees, man is the worker, right? Homo faber, right? And so I think that would be interesting.
Okay,
That's
the
good.
boss of the house is demanding my attention.
Well, Victor, I appreciate the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
I appreciate it too. And okay, now it's
right.
really it's okay. It's family business, and
That's
he's
good.
demanding my attention now. Thank you very much, Ben, for inviting me. And now I really have to.
Okay. All right. See you, Victor. Have a good night.
Bye bye, Ben.
Bye bye.